last week we left off talking about police power. We did talk a little bit, like we real briefly went over the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, these amendments, and it killed me because I would love to go over in more detail all those amendments. But for sake of time, I'm going to refrain from doing that because you guys read it in the book, and those of you who participated in the discussion did a really, really good job. So I don't feel like I need to reiterate the same things that you guys already shared in your discussion. I think if you guys were reading the discussion and participating in that, you got the content, you got the gist, you got a good overview of how important these amendments are to Americans' civil liberties, their civil rights, the difference between their rights, their liberties, and how the Constitution protects those, and how all of those obviously relate to the criminal justice system and are very, very important to law enforcement and to our whole system within the United States, right? So you guys did a really good job again. If you haven't done it, please hurry up and join the conversation before it just seems like you joined way too late. But yeah, get in on the Constitution discussion and talk about the amendments that you saw and what you kind of got from those. But I won't go over those again. Well, actually, I lied. We will go over those again. Next module is our module 4. We talk about policing within the law. So that's another reason why I'm kind of breezing through this quick, because we're going to talk more about police issues and what happens when police do violate others' rights, when they do violate suspects or victims' constitutional rights, how that affects law enforcement, how that affects cases, and just, again, the importance of policing within the law and not stepping beyond your constitutional power as a law enforcement officer, but staying within your restrictions within the law. So we will kind of touch on that again. That's why, again, I feel okay moving on from that and covering the rest of this chapter pretty briefly. So we talk about police power. The reality is, we have laws in our country. Those laws are created by our legislatures, right? From federal to state to city, county, right? We have all these laws and regulations. But unfortunately, those laws would not mean anything, for lack of a better expression, if there wasn't power to enforce the laws, right? So there has to be some sort of enforcement power given through the legislators who enact the laws in order to enforce the laws. Because if you just make a law, but there's no enforcement, no power behind it, unfortunately, people just won't listen to the law or won't follow it. That's just the reality of humanity, I suppose. So we definitely have police power, and it's derived from all these sources, right? The Constitution, of course, Supreme Court decisions, which are based on their interpretation of the Constitution. Then you have the federal statutes, state constitutions, state statutes, state court decisions, and then all these other various municipal charters and ordinances, right? So all that to say is there is a lot of power and authority given to police, right? We talked about all the things they can't do, and that's what the amendments are for, to restrict police power and restrict government power. But our constitutions also give a lot of power to police and authority to police in order to enforce the law. But of course, there's a balance, right? And that's what your book talks about. It talks about balancing the needs of society and the rights of the individual. Because if you wanted a perfect society with no crime, you would end up with like a police state with total martial law, and that's not good, right? You don't want this dictatorship type of a society, right? So there has to be a balance between enforcing the law, right, and keeping things in order versus giving people freedom. But if you just allow freedom to reign and you have, kind of like that anarchist view, like, hey, no law and orders, let people do whatever they want to do, that obviously doesn't function well in society either. So there's this constant balance of people's individual rights and the needs of the society and keeping things within order, right? So you had your book talks about a couple different theories, like the conflict theory. Interesting that they mentioned that one. That's really based on the Communist Manifesto, actually, believe it or not. So very communist. It came from communism, came from like Marx and stuff like that. But basically the theory goes, you have the people that are in control, and then they create laws just to essentially to suppress and keep themselves in power and other people not in power. So you have the wealthy, successful, rich, powerful. They are the ones that are creating laws in order to, for all the, the proletariat or just all the lower classes just to remain lower, because the laws are going to inevitably kind of oppress them and keep them down and keep the people in power up. That's a fairly negative idea of laws and criminal justice, but that's one theory. The consensus theory is more sociological in nature. It basically is like, hey, we have laws because the majority of society agrees on these things. Like the majority of society thinks that, hey, murdering is wrong. And so that's why murder is against the law. The majority of society thinks we should protect children. And so that's why, we have all these child abuse laws and things like that. The majority of society thinks that, we should protect women, right? And so that's why we have these sex crimes and rapes not allowed and all these things, right? So it's because this is a consensus. The majority of society agrees that these things are wrong and not allowed. And so that's why we have the laws. So two different theories there within criminal justice. And then your book kind of talks about the pendulum, right? You have two sides of things. So there's crime control versus due process, right? And law enforcement, you have to kind of strike the balance, because if you really want to stop crime, you, in theory, okay, if all the cops got together and was like, hey, look, we know who the bad dudes are, let's just go and arrest them all, right? Let's just go bust down their doors, arrest them all, put them all in jail, and let's just be done with this. Like the mafia, the mobs, the drug dealers, the gangs, let's just go in and take them all out, and okay, we'll control crime that way. We'll just clean house and get rid of all these people. But that gives no Diego, can you see the screen now? Hopefully. Yes. Okay, cool. But yeah, so, but that doesn't give any consideration to due process. And the reality is law enforcement can't just do that. They have to have warrants to search people's homes. They have to have due process. They have to have probable cause and reasons to go and arrest all these people. They can't just arrest all these people because they think they're mob leaders or criminals or gang leaders, stuff like that. So there's this balance of due process versus crime control, right? And obviously due process is potentially, I'm not gonna say probably, but potentially one of the most important aspects of the amendments to the Constitution. And a lot of you guys wrote about that in the Fifth Amendment and also the 14th Amendment. And then you have conservative versus liberal crime control policies. That's just, again, there's just like in our country, everything is, either conservative or liberal. You have these two extremes, and generally the right answer is somewhere in the middle. And a lot of people don't like that idea, but I feel pretty safe staying in the middle. Usually either extreme on one end is usually an extreme for a reason, and there's problems with it. The book talks about retributive versus restorative justice. And these are, again, two computing views. And there's actually been a shift. Typically, law enforcement through the ages has been very retributive. Like, hey, this person committed a crime, we are going to punish them. Retribution, punish the offender. And it really didn't matter. The victim didn't necessarily matter, or, it really mattered, like, no, who was the person who broke the law, and we're going to punish them. And it doesn't matter why they broke the law. They broke the law, let's get punishment out, right? The restorative kind of view towards justice is a little bit different. It considers the needs of the victim and the offender, right? In retributive, it's like, who cares who the victim is? The victim's irrelevant. The fact is a crime was committed and we're gonna punish the offender. But in restorative, it's like, no, like the victim really matters, and justice isn't just punishing the offender, but it's actually bringing restoration to the victim. So if someone's a victim of robbery or a victim of burglary or a victim of any number of violent crimes, how can we restore that victim and help them to recover, not just by punishing the offender, but also bringing restoration to the victim? So a different view, and it obviously makes a lot of sense when you can consider things, but there's a balance there, right? And then even talking about the needs of the offender, right? And that's when we're going to talk about that a lot more later on in this class when we talk about corrections and jail and prison and the focus of those things. Are they actually rehabilitation? Can we rehabilitate the offender so that they don't commit crimes in the future, or do we really just need to punish them? And is that sufficient? What's kind of the goal of the justice system? So you have those two things. Here's a kind of a breakdown of retributive versus restorative. Again, the focus on restorative is really, it's about the victim and about the person who the crime was committed against, right? And one of the focuses in restorative is focus on problem solving, which obviously we've talked a lot about within community policing and that problem solving. And community is involved in that process. And victims are essential to the process. One of the main problems, and your book has a cool kind of picture of like a leaky net, right? It's this leaky net problem. The idea is, yeah, it'd be really great if every criminal who robbed somebody and was caught would then pay them back, right? Like, hey, if somebody robbed you, took your wallet, took all your money, it would be nice if that person, as part of their punishment, was like, hey, they need to pay you back. But the reality is, most of those criminals either can't pay you back, simply won't pay you back, or just don't have the means to pay you back, or they never get convicted of the crime in the first place, or whatnot. So most people who are victims, in that sense, they don't, through the justice system, through our criminal justice system, they don't get restored in that sense. They don't get their stuff back. That's not part of the process. And so, and we're just talking about theft in this sense, but in all different crimes, there could be a restorative process if you consider the victim, and that's really challenging, and that's a huge issue of like how can that practically happen? How do we make that happen? And so that's a big discussion within criminal justice. How do we restore the victim and help them out? In reality, the most effective way, at least within property crimes, that's why we want people to have insurance, because the insurance companies will pay for you to get your stuff back. But in those instances where, hey, I don't have insurance or whatnot, or insurance doesn't cover it, you're just a victim, right? It's not your fault your stuff got stolen. But restoring the victim's life and losses is a focus of restorative justice. Whereas again, retributive justice, like, hey, our focus, our point, we're just going to punish the guy so he doesn't hurt anybody else. We can't really do much about what he's already done to victims, but we're going to punish him so that he won't victimize anybody else. So you got those two different sides, right? And they both have their strengths and their weaknesses, of course. And again, probably somewhere in the middle would be the best. We talk about, your book talks about discretion, and I think we talked about discretion even in chapter 1 and chapter 4. Discretion's huge. It's important, and it's found throughout the criminal justice system, and it's really the freedom to make judgments. And so everybody within the criminal justice system really does have discretion and is allowed to have discretion, because every situation is different. So on the one hand, you want equality, and you want things to be fair. So you want everybody who, I keep going back to stealing something, but everybody who steals something should be punished the same way, right? The punishment should fit the crime, and everybody who commits a crime, that the punishment should be the same. Everyone who beats somebody up should have the same kind of punishment. Everybody who rapes someone should have the same kind of punishment. Go down the list of all the different crimes that we're going to talk about in chapter 3, and the punishment should be the same. But the reality is there's discretion, there's different reasons, there's different factors involved, and so that's allowed. As a cop, if you're on the street and you catch somebody dealing drugs or doing some kind of illegal drugs, you have the discretion. Okay, the law says that what they're doing is illegal. Do I arrest them and take them to jail, or do I just take their illegal drugs and then refer them to a rehabilitation program? What's going to be better for that person? And is there a right or wrong thing, or does the officer actually have the discretion? Okay, can he arrest? Can he not arrest? Does he have to arrest, or does he have the discretion to arrest or not to arrest, potentially realizing, hey, I could actually help this victim or help this offender instead of just taking him to jail? So you kind of have that discretion, and that's that's kind of the situation there. So that's why discretion is important, right? And that's the same thing with like a judge. When a judge is issuing his verdict, you know, the judge has that discretion to whether he's going to be lenient or he's going to be harsh, right? If he's decided, you know what, this is the fourth time you've been caught, you know, doing this particular crime, like leniency is off, I'm going to be harder on you now. Or if the judge can say, you know what, maybe this is your first time and I could see that you recognize it was a mistake. I'm going to be lenient on you and I'm just going to assign you community service instead of jail time because I think that would be more beneficial for you. So there's that discretion even within the courts, obviously, and the judge has discretion on how he's going to issue his sentences, what the sentence is going to be, right? And of course, it makes sense because no case is the same, right? And that's kind of the idea. But sometimes it also doesn't seem fair, right? And so then you get questions of, well, is that fair? Was that person given a harsher sentence because he's Black? Is that why? Well, that's not right, right? And so so then you have the issue of like, well, is discretion actually just a nice way of discrimination, right? And so you have that issue as well. And so it's always discussion, and it's very fluid, and you're working those things out. And then again, just talk about that pendulum, right? A pendulum is something that swings back and forth. You swing to the right side, you swing to the left side. On the right, the focus is on crime control, like, hey, we need to stop crime no matter what, right? On the left side, it's like, yeah, we don't want crime, but it's the rights of people is more important. So it's more important that this person gets a fair trial than that they get convicted. So, take a guilty person, somebody who's guilty of sin, absolutely was wrong and did something wrong. On the one hand, you have people have like, no matter what, he needs to be caught on the one hand, but then, indicted, sentenced, and punished for that crime. And that should be the focus. On the other hand, though, you have people that are like, well, he's guilty, but the most important thing is that he has a fair trial. He has an impartial jury, that he's given a chance to defend himself. Dude's guilty is all get out, right? But still, his rights are paramount. His rights are more important. So you have that kind of pendulum swinging of what the focus of the justice system should be. And again, the reality is probably should be somewhere in the middle, right? You have to take their rights into consideration, but also like, hey, the fact that, hey, he's guilty and that we need to stop crime is there. And so, you have the discretion on one end, you have the rigid adherence on the other end, and then you have retribution and restorative justice and those focuses. Okay, so that kind of wraps up chapter 2.